Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My guests today are Dr. Sabrina Mittermeier and Dr. Veronika Keller. Welcome to you both and thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
All right, it's my pleasure to have you on, and I must admit I've been eagerly awaiting this episode, and I'm especially excited to discuss your new book, the edited collection, From Broadway to the Bronx, New York City's History Through Song. Before we jump into the book, though, let's just find out a little bit more about yourselves. So firstly, Sabrina, why don't you tell me where you're calling in from, and just tell us, sort of a little bit who you are, what you do as a profession, that kind of thing.
I'm in Munich, Germany. I have a PhD in American cultural history. I've written a book that used to be my dissertation on the cultural history of Disneyland that was also published with Intellect. I've also done other work on Star Trek and more work on Disney, and Fan Phenomena Disney is also out with Intellect. So I do a lot of pop culture, but this is my first book that has anything to do with music, really. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And Veronika, tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
It's not my first book about music because I have my PhD in musicology. I'm in Koblenz right now, where I work, but I also come from a town near Munich, so we're both from basically the same place. And yeah, I'm working at a university right now, and I did my research about American students in Germany. So that's the connection with American studies for my PhD. And right now I mostly do also pop culture and music in video games, which is basically ludomusicology. And I have some interest in pop songs in Korean dramas, which is right now my new way of looking into pop music of today.
Okay, and you've just come back from Seoul as well.
I was October last year, but yes, it's still recently in my heart.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you've got quite a lot of crossover, but that you're coming at this from different disciplinary perspectives as well. So that's always interesting. But did you two know each other before you embarked on this project? Did you know each other from the homeland kind of thing back from
So we didn't quite do our PhDs together, but we were in the same kind of PhD colloquiums, or like where people come to present their work every week. Because of Veronika's connection to American studies as well. And so we met, I don't know, it's been, I want to say like 10 years, I think, almost. Yeah.
But this is the first project that you've actively worked on together.
I think we tried to write a paper once that didn't get published, but yeah, that was.
Well, I'm glad that we could change that here at Intellect. So
I wrote the music chapter for your Star Trek book.
That's true, yes. Sorry, that book had 60 authors. I can sometimes not even remember like who of my friends was on the book, but yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, and this book too is an edited collection, right? So it sounds like you're both gluttons for punishment. I know you've both worked on edited collections in the past. So how was the process of working together, and of course just in general herding all those academic cats? It can be I know it can be a trial to make sure everyone's submitting everything on time and in the right format, but how was the process overall?
Veronika, how's working with me?
Always pleasant.
You have to say that. No. Diplomatic answer.
Yeah, I think we started when, at least in Germany, there were still Corona going on.
Yeah, there were lockdowns.
And then we had also changes of jobs, and I moved to Koblenz. And so in our private life, there was quite a lot. And we always had to of course, put the book also in our schedules.
Yeah, I think like the earliest idea for this was pre-COVID, and then it went through several iterations and trying to figure out what the project actually looks like. Like the call was a lot wider. So right now the book focuses on artists that are from New York and like do music, like write about or like sing about New York as well. And like the call originally was broader to have any kind of songs focused in New York, whether or not the artists were from there. So things like the Pet Shop Boys singing about like New York City Boys, something like that would have been in there. But then all like the majority of submissions we got were sort of New York artists focus, and so it felt like we would shift that, and there's been other stuff. I mean, you know, like this project, people join, people have to drop out for various reasons, and particularly because the pandemic hit. And yeah, I think since this book started, I moved twice. Yeah, but yeah,
that's fascinating though. The I think that can only really happen with edited collections in this way, and that they can survive a pandemic. It is that you never quite know where they're going to end up. You put that call out, and you think, oh well, this is definitely this is where we're going to how we're going to position this, and then you don't get anything you expect comes back, and you have to kind of maybe rethink. And I always think that's quite fascinating. I was just gonna, I guess you've kind of jumped in there a little bit, Sabrina, but the marketing kind of spiel for the book I think is quite nice and neat, and it says that this book is a fascinating and vibrant depiction of New York City in song across a variety of different genres, focusing on Broadway, musical theatre, hip-hop, punk, folk, and jazz, as well as the work of New York-born artists and those who are intimately connected with the city. I do quite like that. So that's kind of where it is now, and that's the kind of book that's soon to be released in towards the end of July. But like, so this is always interesting to me as well. So are either of you, neither of you were born in New York. Now, have either of you been to New York? Sabrina, you have, right?
Several times, yes.
Several times. But Veronika, you haven't. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which I think is awesome. I think it's very fascinating. Fascinating because I think that says a lot about New York and its uniqueness as a city, as a cultural locus, however you want to phrase it. That it's had so much impact on all of us internationally, that it has often, as a geographic location, led us to become scholars or people involved in music or the culture industries. I know that's kind of my tale, a tale of two cities, although one of them was a rural town in England where I spent my youth listening to all this music that was coming out of New York, and then ended up sort of heading through publishing to live there one day. Is kind of, and I know quite a few people have made that similar junction. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of the book's scopus, its focus, but like around New York to begin with. So I like this notion of being intimately connected with the city, even if we haven't necessarily visited or if we don't live there. So what would you describe that you're both intimately connected to the city through culture or through your own experiences there? Sabrina, perhaps I could start with you if you've actually spent a few times there. What's your connection to New York, and why do you think it's so kind of powerful as like a cultural locus for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've thought about this more because I teach a class on the history of New York, first time 3 years ago and right now, and it's, I mean, for me, it's a thing that, like, it looms very large, right? Because it's featured in so many films, it's featured in so many television series, even if not all of them have actually filmed there, obviously. Like, quite often Vancouver stands in for it, or,
right.
or like an LA studio lot, obviously. But like, but also, yeah, and the music and like Broadway musicals and all of this, and it's, yeah, and I think you start to connect through it through pop culture. I think I first visited when I was 16, so it's quite a while ago, and even I can tell how much it has changed since. Like, I've been sort of regularly been back. I don't know how many times I've been. I want to say like 6 times, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I always liked it. Like, I fell in love with the city. I really like the city. I mean, I could probably never really afford to live there. I mean, at least definitely not Manhattan. But even Brooklyn is getting more and more difficult. But yeah, I think there's a certain weird connection, and I always want to go back, basically. So.
Thank you. And Veronika, what about yourself? How about from your perspective?
I would say also for me, especially TV series, because they were in Germany also on TV. So like Friends, even if they are not shot, of course, on location every time, but New York is basically the Seventh Friend, or something like that, and of course Sex and the City, and so many sitcoms. And so you kind of grow up, even in Germany, with like New York being that modern metropolitan. You want to go there to live this pop culture you see, and of course also all the different musical genres, to like go to a jazz club and then hear some hip hop, and then go to the subway and hear some singer-songwriter for the first time. So that it's very endearing. And yeah,
I think having so many different people and so many different ethnicities and different groups of people living so close together, but like retaining their kind of identity and retaining lots of culture from the old country, as it were, but then mixing that together in such a kind of a cultural melting pot there. It has certainly a unique place, and certainly creates some really fascinating genres of music that we would associate with the city. I'm thinking also of like Long Island hardcore as well, just because it's not something I knew much about, but when I was living there, I seemed to be surrounded by all these people around my age who were all like from this scene that like I kind of knew a little bit about peripherally growing up, but then I tracked more with like hip hop culture, so I was much more aware of that. But then when you talk to these guys, they're all really into hip hop and know an incredible amount of hip hop, but it's also coming out of these DIY hardcore and punk scenes on like Long Island or in the suburbs, and then coming into Brooklyn and Queens and places, and building their lives in the city, whatever it is that they're doing, and then interacting more with hip hop or jazz, and then all of those genres kind of intertwining. And I always thought that was quite a fascinating part of it for me too. But talking about genres, are there any that you personally feel particularly connected to when you think about New York? Is there a particular song and a particular genre, Sabrina, that you go to when you're like, yeah, that's New York for me?
Probably actually musical.
Oh, yeah.
Because I love stage musical, or
Yeah.
like film musical too, but a lot of film musicals actually stage musical first. And I mean, I go see a lot of them when I get a chance to go to New York. I mean, certainly like Rent, that we might talk about later, that, and so many, West Side Story, all of these like big musicals that are set in New York. Other than that, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things right now. I'm like embarrassingly thinking of Taylor Swift coming to New York, which is the least New York thing you can think of. But yeah, I think it's just the variety. Obviously, hip hop. I have to admit, I'm not like a huge hip hop fan, or like have a lot that's where James comes in. But yeah, punk certainly as well, like CBGBs and these like old clubs that came out in New York.
Yeah, that's true. There's definitely like these locations that are kind of mythic. A lot of them closed down, of course, but as a part of gentrification and all the changes that's going on there. So that's always interesting. Yeah, you mentioned CBGBs, but you've got places like the Tunnel. There's obviously Latin Quarters, like tons and tons of places throughout New York's history, whether it be for disco or hip hop or punk. And then St. Vitus, I think, in Brooklyn recently closed, which was, of course, a really famous punk hardcore venue. So that process is ongoing. So interesting how it almost eats itself in a sense. And Veronika, how about yourself? And what sort of genre or maybe song would you most sort of associate with New York? What's your go-to when you're thinking about this as a topic?
I would say hip hop, definitely, especially the like 80s, 90s. I have for myself a little bit of a self-revival of all the 90s stuff I heard back then because of the seminar. And because I always have this historian perspective in me too. So it's actually songs from the 30s. And I particularly like the Marx Brothers very much, and they, with their dialect and their typical style of humor, which then informed also the sitcoms later on. Even I think Seinfeld had some Marx Brother in it. So for me, outside of music, because music is quite a lot for me, but I think Marx Brothers and then later on hip hop are the two main things for me when I think about New York.
An interesting combo, and I'm sure there must be some Marx Brothers influenced rappers out there, or some kind of textual referencing for sure. Interesting. You just made me think though, because you're both kind of obviously heralding from New York, from Munich, writing about New York. Now, so many 90s rappers, 80s and 90s rappers, they come to Germany in particular, but UK, France, but Germany especially, to get their pensions paid effectively, because we have so much respect for these 80s and 90s hip-hop artists, rappers, musicians, DJs, and figures from the hip-hop community, especially that kind of boom bap New York. So Jeru the Damager, who's from East New York, past Brownsville in Brooklyn, very famous kind of New York rapper from the 90s. He lives in Germany now. I think he's in, I forget wherever he's in, Dusseldorf or in something or other, but he's definitely 100% living there. Going about his days, as a, and getting, getting paid and getting more gigs and having more influence in Europe than he would perhaps in New York now. And of course, a lot of people talk about that and how some of these genres have outlived the city that birthed them. And I think hip hop obviously is probably the greatest example of that.
And also, like, speaking of disco, like people like Donna Summer actually recorded in Munich. So there's like, because we had this like really famous recording studio, Musicland, in the 80s. So like Queen recorded there, and Freddie Mercury lived in Munich for a while as well. Like lots of people recorded in the studio. And like especially all that like super early disco stuff. So Donna Summer actually was fluent in German, and she lived here for a long time. So and then she went back to the US, right? And became connected to New York. So we actually have a chapter about Donna Summer as well.
Well, that leads me nicely onto my next question then. I would like to talk a bit about the table of contents, and just tell us a bit about some of the key chapters. Don't people can find their own path, but just, maybe just highlight a few of the topics just so that we can see the range, because I think that's one of the book's real strengths, is it's not all obvious stuff, and there's some really interesting connections you've drawn. And of course, you've, highlight a few of your contributors as well, because I feel like there's a real wealth and depth of international talent there. Obviously people who are connected to New York more physically, and others who are, more culturally or whatever. So it's a really interesting kind of selection. So I don't know, Sabrina, maybe you jump off and then hand over to Veronika, and maybe also tell us a little bit how you chose some of these, because you must have got a wealth and depth of topics, and not everything was able to make the cut. And as editors, I know that can be a real challenge, but would love to hear some of your takes on that.
I mean, I think so, as I like said, we had this like broader focus in the beginning, but like we still obviously had to pick and choose. We definitely, I think, had at least double the amount of abstracts that we now have in the final. And then sort of the picking and choosing happens, and then obviously also identify gaps where you're like we can't do a book like this without having certain, like, I mean, we have several chapters on hip hop, but like certain artists or certain things. So I think we have quite an interesting mix of that. So like hip hop, we have the Wu-Tang Clan, or we have certain hip hop collaborations.
Something on Lil Kim, isn't there?
Lil Kim, for instance, yes. And like for me personally, obviously, so I got to interview Anthony Rapp, who starred in the original production of Friends, and we talked about Jonathan Larson, because Jonathan Larson died in the early 90s, like right before Rent premiered, so you can't talk to him anymore, but like that's the closest thing. So that was really cool. I mean, I'm a big Billy Joel fan, so that's probably one of the like artists I associate with him most. So we have a chapter on him. I said Donna Summer, like, and The Wiz, and yeah, I mean, I think the biggest gap we unfortunately have, because someone had to drop out, is the Ramones. Like, that's kind of my biggest, like, the missing, but like Blondie, and it's like you just start to realize how many people there are. And I know Stephen Petrus wrote a chapter on Lou Reed, for instance. And I mean, in terms of the authors, I think it's a nice mix. We also tried to have this mix of like, early career scholars. So like Brianna Wade, who wrote the chapter in Wu-Tang Clan, as a PhD a student.
Great chapter.
For instance, or like Stephen Petrus is really established in this niche, and he's done like exhibits in New York, and he works for an archive in New York, and it's like this range. Veronika, tell us all about the things I'm currently like completely blanking on, please.
I think especially what I was looking for and what I also wrote about is the early days, because of course all recording industry in New York and all the artists didn't start after the Second World War, but basically already in the 19th century with Tin Pan Alley and their artists. And so that's my article, which I wanted to write about. So I was happy nobody else wanted to write about that. And then, of course, the early musicals, sometimes connecting to also the musicals in the 80s with same songs like 42nd Broadway and 42nd Street, and also, but within the Heights, the nowadays musical scene in New York. So, of course, that's Broadway is central, and that was also a point that we don't only show what's today and or what started in the like 70s, because we have a kind of gap also with the 50s and 60s, just because we didn't get anything from that time frame. But I think we filled in the gap with some of the musicals.
Yeah, well, let me just interject there quickly and say, this isn't meant to be an encyclopedic history, decade by decade, like we've seen in cinema studies and things like that in the past. This is really, this is why I think your editorship has been really interesting, because, you've taken, there's always going to be, detractors and people complain, well, what about this? What about that? And you put out a call and you got back what you got, and you were able to engineer a fantastic volume covering all these different aspects. So I'm almost more interested in what, not that there's an omission, but it's like, oh, fascinating take. Oh, this is breaking new ground. So I think it's really innovative and interesting in terms of what you have included. Maybe tell us a little bit, Veronika, about that process. Like, were there any trials and tribulations when it came to, making cuts, and what got in, what was pushed out? I remember, I think we had to chuck you a few extra words in the end, didn't we, to try and allow for another chapter? Or maybe we should have.
It's also so pandemic.
Yeah, right. You're trying to remember. We all had pandemic brain. You're trying to remember.
I think honestly, the biggest trial and tribulations was trying to get it done over the pandemic and dealing with the fact that like people take longer. I was actually like also on sick leave during this. It just was lucky that it happened when the book was under review, so that didn't slow it down further. But I do know like it was really just like working through this, and I think like early on we talked about maybe putting this into an existing book series, and that didn't happen. So it's sort of this like behind the scenes kind of like making these choices, and then sometimes you just have people who get sick or something happens in their lives, particularly through COVID, and you like need to extend them, and you need to work around this because you want to keep their contribution, and you want to be like sensitive towards their needs. But I think what comes out of it, I think, is a really still, as you said, like a really good mix of things. It's not comprehensive. It would never be. It's still an encyclopedia, but it's like an interesting cursory look, and like having these, I think for me, some more unexpected chapters that I didn't think about, because it's not like my favorite genre. My expertise with things like Public Enemy or Anthrax over there. Like there's so many different things you can do with New York, and you didn't even think about when you put out the call, because it wasn't like on your radar, and then someone submits something on it and you're like, oh, or like Blondie is not even like the expected sort of early Blondie stuff. Like it's a late song of hers about Trump, and we're like, oh, cool, and then obviously like you can't talk about New York without talking about Donald Trump. But like it definitely didn't like immediately, that's not what comes to my mind. I mean, thankfully, but still.
I think that's the thing which makes this volume such a gem, is because there's obviously such a in-depth history, and you've not tried to kind of compete with that and showcase everything, but these unique takes are really, really fascinating. Were there any volumes when you were like delving deeper into the literature or you know, around these topics? Were there any other volumes or any other writers or anything you took inspiration from, or was this kind of very much you were kind of navigating this on your own?
I mean, you do the usual research of like what are the competing titles, and I don't think there isn't all that much, which was more surprising to me. Like, it seems like such an obvious thing to focus on. And I mean, certainly there's books on, like, I'm looking over my shelf and there's like a book on gays on Broadway that I'm supposed to review, but like it's always like a very focused look on something, like obviously Broadway history, or a focused look on New York, like on hip hop, or you know, like all these things. But I had a hard time finding work on like music in New York, and I think even 19th century, like both 19th and 20th century, and even like super obvious things, right? And I mean,
it's really interesting. It's always surprising that when you take a big topic like this, and like you say, there's so much literature, but it's around very specific histories or groups, genres, and then the snapshot is kind of not there, which is again one of the reasons this is so original. Veronika, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think as a musicologist, I also see that the music itself oftentimes didn't play a role. Even if there is a book about hip hop, then they of course talk about the culture because that's a central thing. But the music itself, sometimes I think people are afraid about music when they didn't study it. They think that they have to know what's a motive, a leitmotif, and then find everything about that. So, and this was one of the things I was happy about in our book, that we had people who were more on the cultural studies side, more on the historical side, and we also had people who were more on the music side. So we were able to show everything basically on that term. And I think that's missing for quite a lot of things, because I'm also always looking for a mixture of cultural studies in music, and then music is like on 2 pages it's mentioned, and then nobody else writes about it, even in movie studies and things like that.
So with that in mind, then, who's the key audience, Veronika, for this volume? Because it sounds like it's a musicologists, but also very much people in cultural studies and also sort of history, I guess. Like, does that sound about right? Or
I think also social studies in a way, and politics. I mean, I think we showed in quite a lot of chapters how politics in New York are connected to either the music itself or how it was depicted in the music. So I think for people who want to look beyond their own borders, can find some inspiration there.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things also teaching the class about the city sort of echoes some of the things that keep coming up in the book. Like how something like hip hop only comes up because the city turns the Bronx into essentially a slum, and like the Cross Bronx Expressway, and like Robin Moses doing like urban planning. So that pops up in several chapters because it was such a like key moment for hip hop artists. But also for the city, and how that, you know, shaped the city, or like issues, obviously, like both gentrification and immigration change everything. And so you keep coming back to that, and like kind of really matters what neighborhood you live in, but also what neighborhood you live in at what point in time, because they keep shifting and they keep changing. And like, I think Rep and I talked about like the East Village changing so radically, like also through the HIV/AIDS crisis, and then later on, and now it's super gentrified and super expensive, but like artists have remained. And it's like sort of like, I think even if you do like urban studies, like to consider how things like music play a role in some of this, and how it's been received. And yeah, I think there's just certain, you get a sense of what actually shaped New York even by just looking at like songs about it, which is maybe not something that people think about immediately.
No, I mean, I think they're great points, guys, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Sabrina, with how people will encounter the city through this volume. Now, regular listeners to the podcast will know that we have a few quick time questions that we throw in towards the end from time to time. So I wanted to ask you a few quick time questions. So, you know, just kind of short, snappy answers, but they're all going to be New York related. So I'll start with you, Sabrina. What's your favorite museum in New York City?
The Met. Because like,
sorry,
should we explain why? I mean, it's a really nice space to be in. I spend way too much money in the gift shop, and I mean, they also have really like interesting big temporary exhibits usually when I'm there. So.
Okay, and Veronika, what's your favorite food synonymous with New York City?
Probably pizza.
I mean, it's hard to beat. I would have, you know, until I lived there, I was like, "What's all the fuss about?" And yeah, the fuss is justified, to say the least. I would probably walk 5,000 miles to go and get a slice from my favorite place. No problem. How about you, Sabrina? While we're talking about food, anything different, or would it be pizza for you too?
I like pizza, although I have to say I don't usually eat in New York that much. Hot dogs come to mind as like something that probably originated there, around there.
Not being a cliche German or anything like that, but like
honestly, for me, hot dog is an American food, not a German food at all.
True.
But I mean, also like New York, I think about like the variety you can get of food. Like also going to Jewish delis and like buying everything. Basically, so yeah, German, like a bagel. That I was gonna say bagel with lox, because Jewish
lox. Yeah, until I first visited New York, so I always wondered what lox was, but you know, but we'll save that for the uninitiated. It's also fun that you said Jewish delis, because I was just thinking about cats, and you know, Cats the Deli, not Cats the Feline, and of course. That leads me on to my next question about favorite TV shows or movies synonymous with New York City, or where New York City is represented. Veronika, do you have a favorite TV show or movie about or set in New York?
I think it's still Friends. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, because you said Cuts. I was going to say When Harry Met Sally anyway, but basically, I mean, other Nora Ephron movies as well, but also Friends and Sex and the City. I just rewatched all of Sex and the City for like the 5th, 6th time. I don't know. So yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say it's they're probably still got a lot of mileage, those TV shows. That's for sure. Yeah. Well, unless we're talking about music, do either of you have a favorite band or musician associated with New York? Sabrina, let's go with you first.
Probably Billy Joel.
Billy Joel, back in the Garden, baby. Okay.
I saw him at the Garden.
You did?
One of his last shows at the Garden. I'm glad I saw it before you stopped the residency. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. That's some pretty New York.
Yeah.
That's pretty New York shenanigans right there. And Veronika, what about yourself?
I have to say the same thing.
And that's the thing.
From the other perspective is, of course, that there is Metropolitan Opera. And in at least in Germany, we are able to watch the opera in our cinemas. We have to pay for that, but so basically bringing New York and their opera scene to German cinemas. So it's of course not an artist in itself, but I think Metropolitan Opera, watching that with other people. Is quite an experience also when you're just in Germany and can't fly there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I know Intellect's managing director Mark Lewis is a big fan of watching the Metropolitan Opera virtually, you know, and I think that was something that really kind of provided a lot of entertainment and culture for people during the pandemic. I mean, I know loads of galleries and opera houses and things did the same.
And Broadway musicals are like it. We're starting to have a culture of like filming both theater and stage musical, because like you can usually only see these things when you go to New York or maybe London, and like it's kind of a shame. And so when they filmed like the original cast of Hamilton, it was like, and that was also a big pandemic release, and I think they're starting to do more. It's still very cautious, but I'm like, come on, the vast majority of people will never experience this because not everyone can fly to New York and then also pay like $300 for a ticket,
Very true. Yeah, it's I saw a lot of my favorite New York artists, not in New York, but in the UK and in Europe, where they were a lot cheaper to go and see as well.
Yeah.
But I did manage to, there were a few that I did manage to kind of sweep up. I'd never seen Rakim, the 80s rapper, and to see Rakim on my last night in New York with a live band was kind of a pretty cool memory for me. Speaking of memories, are there any memories, Sabrina, of your times in New York? Maybe any other shows or concerts or anything else that really stands out to you as like a...
I saw Angels in America, like the 2 parts of it. There's like 7 hours total, and you wouldn't believe it how quickly 7 hours can pass by something. It's pretty good. And I got like the original poster of Angels in America tattooed on my arm, which was also done in New York. So I think that's a pretty key memory. Another key memory is really funny because it's related to Anthony Rapp, who I interviewed. So I had met him a few times at like Star Trek conventions before. But then after we did this interview, like later last fall, I was in New York and I was on the picket line to do because SAG-AFTRA and WGA, like the Hollywood unions, were on strike. But we were at New York Labor Day parade in September, and it's there were hundreds of thousands of people there, and we managed to run into each other. I ran into because he's a union leader, him and his partner and his baby, and we ran into each other at this massive Labor Day protest. So yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a cool story to tell. And Veronika, obviously having not been there in person, but I was thinking maybe when you were undertaking the research for this book, did you encounter any particularly interesting anecdotes or any funny stories or anything that really stuck with you? Throw you on the spot there a bit.
No, it's more. I have to admit that it's more sad stories because I kind of concentrated on immigration and also the Bowery was also disconnected from the city, and so similar things happened to the Bowery in the 19th century, to Bronx. So it wasn't that happy. Yeah. So I think. No actual story comes to mind in that regard right now.
It's a good point you raised there, because I think that is something that maybe I haven't dwelled upon enough in this conversation, but the historical analysis is fascinating and fantastic. And I think there's a lot of gems in there that people won't necessarily have encountered. And then maybe they'll, will read this book and then they'll want to go and spend time at the, Tenement Museum and things like that, rather than just being at the Met and the MoMA. So I think this book opens doors for different perspectives and about different groups of people and how their passageway created all this culture and stuff. So I think that's a really interesting point, and a point that we're going to basically end on. But finally, I did want to just ask you both. Let's start with you, Veronika. What are you working on currently? Is there anything in the wings? Any other books, journals, projects?
I just recently published, but in German, an article about music in video games and education. Because how you can put it into your both in school as well at university, and I hope I can write an article about Netflix and pop songs and K-dramas in October, and then we'll publish that. And otherwise, just teaching university is also.
That old chestnut, that whole teaching thing. And Sabrina, what about yourself?
Yeah, I just very recently published a special issue of the Journal of American Culture on Disney at 100, together with Peter Bryan.
Excellent.
And yesterday a paper of mine came out, which is connected to my second book project, if I ever finish my second book, but that's a different story. But I talk looking at queer television history in the US and in Germany. And I soon have it, because it's an intellect journal, with the Journal of Popular Television, a special issue on Ted Lasso. That's currently in it's in copy editing. So will be soon. I think.
Yeah, I've had a sneak peek. It's a very cool article. Looking forward to getting that one published. And well, I'm going to use that just to plug into like a little bit more, which I tend not to do too much, but you know, when in Rome and all that. Sabrina, of course, you mentioned Disney there, and obviously you have the 2 books with us, which kind of jumped off our real fascination with Disney studies. And of course, you're an associate editor now for the forthcoming International Journal of Disney Studies, which is a new, amazing, groundbreaking, huge undertaking, intellect publication, with Rebecca and Robin at the helm, but with a very diverse and large team of associate editors working on the publication too. So I'd recommend everyone take a look at that. Any final thoughts on that publication? How's that going?
As far as I know, we're about to like wrap up the first issue. I do book reviews, so I know I have like 2 or 3 in the pipeline that are basically done. And as far as I know, we have to turn that all in September, and then I think it gets published early next year.
That's right.
I'm on the correct timeline. So yeah,
well,
seems to be doing well.
That's my take too. But also, if anyone is interested in Disney, listening to this, then do check out Sabrina's work, because there's a number of titles on the Intellect website. And of course, Veronika, anything else that you would like to sort of finally plug here? Anything else that you really sort of have been working on, or you're proud to get off your desk? Anything out there that people might want to Google around yourself?
Right now, I'm good with that, what I am already working on.
Awesome. Well, look, let me just say thank you both so much for your time today. It's been wonderful having you on as guests. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your busy days as researchers, teachers, and all the other things that you're both up to. And From Broadway to the Bronx, New York City's History Through Song will be available and published on July 26th, currently available for pre-order at intellectbooks.com and from all good bookstores. So please do check that out. And again, thank you both so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure having you on the In Conversation podcast.
Thank you.